In the year 1847, within the crumbling walls of a Charleston County plantation house, being torn down brick by brick, construction workers made a discovery that would chill them to their bones. Hidden deep inside the plaster and timber, wrapped carefully in oilcloth stained with age, lay a confession letter. Blood had soaked into its edges long ago, turning the paper's corners a rusty brown that spoke of violence. What made this document extraordinary wasn't just the horror it described, the deliberate killing of an enslaved woman named Patience, or even the meticulous details of how powerful men had buried the truth. No, what made authorities immediately seal this file away for 7 full decades was something far more unsettling. 2 different hands had written this confession. One belonged to an adult, steady and practiced. The other, a child's careful script, uncertain letters formed by fingers no older than 8 years. And this child's account contradicted every single word in the official records. The Charleston Historical Society wouldn't speak about whether this letter was genuine. Not for years and years, not until 1923 finally arrived. They cited civic reputation, community standing, the delicate matter of protecting certain families' legacies. But tonight, right now, we're going to reveal exactly what that little girl witnessed inside a barn on the 14th of August, 1834. And you're going to understand why some truths get buried deeper than any coffin ever could. But before we step back into that darkness, before we walk through the doors of Magnolia Ridge Plantation, I need something from you. Right now, hit that subscribe button. Because stories like this one, the histories they tried to erase with fire and silence and carefully worded lies, these stories need voices. They need to be told. And I want you to leave a comment. Tell me what state you're in, what city you're listening from. I want to know where you are when you hear these dark chapters of American history, these truths that powerful people thought they'd buried forever. Everything we're about to discuss, every document we're going to examine, remained classified, locked away, until something significant happened. The last living descendant of the Rutledge family died without leaving any heirs behind. And when that happened, their private papers, all those carefully guarded secrets, were finally released to the state archives. Magnolia Ridge sat about 12 miles inland from Charleston's bustling port. Far enough from the coastal humidity to make the tobacco crops viable, close enough to the harbor to ship those leaves profitably across the ocean. In 1834, it was one among 43 plantations operating throughout the county. Not the biggest operation, not the smallest either. 62 enslaved human beings worked across 400 acres of land. The main house, built back in 1809, featured those Greek revival columns that every ambitious planter craved. Columns painted brilliant white that blistered and peeled under the relentless southern sun. The plantation had a reputation for stability, for being unremarkable, just another prosperous estate among its neighbors. Samuel Rutledge inherited this property from his father in 1828. He was 31 years old. Unlike some of the flashier planters who spent entire seasons in Charleston society, attending balls and dinners and making themselves seen, Samuel preferred the quiet routine of managing his agricultural investments. He kept records that were meticulous, almost obsessive. He purchased breeding stock of good quality. He maintained what he called reasonable discipline among his workforce, words that meant something very different than they sound. His wife Catherine had died bringing their only son Thomas into the world back in 1830. After her death, Samuel raised the boy with help from his widowed sister Margaret, who packed up her life and moved into the manor that same year, taking over the household management with fierce efficiency. The plantation operated under the conventional hierarchy that everyone understood. An overseer named Dutch Calloway, hired from Georgia in 1832, managed the field hands with an iron fist. 2 house servants, elderly women named Bess and Clara, handled all the cooking and cleaning inside the main house. The rest, all those other souls, worked the tobacco fields. Their days were measured by the brutal South Carolina sun and the overseer's bell that rang to control their every movement. Among those 62 human beings was a woman named Patience Drummond. She was 26 years old and had been born right there on that property. The official records listed her simply as capable field hand, no known complications. But the people who actually knew Patience, who worked alongside her and lived beside her, they remembered something else entirely. They remembered a singing voice that carried across the fields during harvest season, clear and haunting, a sound that could make you stop whatever you were doing just to listen. She had a daughter. Ruby born in 1826. The father's name appeared nowhere in the plantation books, which wasn't unusual at all. So many silences existed in those pages, so many blank spaces where names should have been. Ruby started working in the manor house when she was only 6 years old, learning basic household tasks under Bess's patient instruction. She was small for her age, unusually quiet, with her mother's dark eyes and a habit of watching everything with an intensity that made some adults uncomfortable. Samuel Rutledge had approved her transfer from field work, noting in his careful ledger that the girl shows aptitude for domestic service and may prove valuable in that capacity. Just numbers, just property, just value calculated in dollars. The summer of 1834 was particularly vicious. The temperature climbed above 95 degrees for 18 consecutive days in July. 2 elderly field workers died from what the plantation doctor called heat apoplexy, which was just a fancy way of saying they worked themselves to death in the sun. The tobacco crops suffered badly, leaves yellowing before their time, and Dutch Calloway grew increasingly irritable, extending the work hours longer and longer, reducing the water breaks that kept people alive. Tensions simmered across Magnolia Ridge like those heat waves rising from the red clay. Inside the big house, 8-year-old Thomas Rutledge spent his days with a tutor imported from Charleston, learning Latin and mathematics while his father reviewed accounts in the study. The boy had inherited his mother's fair coloring and his father's serious demeanor, already showing signs of the stern planter he was being groomed to become. Ruby saw him often during her duties. This other child whose world existed in the exact same physical space as hers, yet remained impossibly, insurmountably distant. Margaret Rutledge, 38 years old, managed the household with firm efficiency that bordered on military precision. She'd never married. Gossip whispered about a broken engagement in her youth, but she never spoke of it, never explained. Instead, she channeled all her energies into making Magnolia Ridge a model of Southern domesticity, at least within the manor's walls. She inspected Ruby's work with a critical eye that missed nothing, correcting the placement of silverware and the folding of linens, but she never raised her voice, always maintaining that cool courtesy that Charleston society absolutely demanded. The barn where everything would happen sat 200 yards behind the manor house. It was a substantial structure that housed the workhorses and equipment, serving as storage for tools and seed. Built from pine planks over oak framing, with a loft accessible by ladder where hay and supplies were kept. Dutch Calloway maintained a small office in one corner, little more than a desk and a chair where he kept his records and, according to later testimony that would eventually emerge, a bottle of whiskey hidden inside a grain barrel. Patients had been assigned to evening barn duties that August, feeding and watering the horses after the field work ended. This was lighter work than picking tobacco under that merciless sun, and some people speculated it was a kindness from Samuel Rutledge, though his ledgers mentioned only reassignment due to declining field productivity. She would arrive at dusk each evening, spend an hour with the animals, then return to the slave quarters, that row of small cabins visible from the manor's second-floor windows. Life at Magnolia Ridge followed patterns established over decades across the entire South. A carefully maintained hierarchy where everyone knew their place and understood the consequences of forgetting it, even for a moment. The work was brutally hard but predictable. The punishments were harsh, but not unusually so by the standards of 1834. Samuel Rutledge considered himself a reasonable man, better than some of his neighbors who were known for their cruelty, not as soft as others who let their enslaved workers get away with too much. He attended church every Sunday, paid his debts on time, and expected the same order from his household that he maintained in those carefully ruled ledger columns. Nothing in those neat numbers suggested that within days, blood would stain the barn floor in patterns that couldn't be explained away. Nothing in the peaceful routine of morning bells and evening prayers indicated that a child would witness something that would haunt her for 70 years, something she could never forget no matter how hard she tried. The documents would later reveal that Ruby was supposed to be asleep in the house servants' quarters that night, safe in her small bed. Instead, she'd gone looking for her mother, August 14th. 1834 began exactly like any other Thursday at Magnolia Ridge. The sun rose at 5:47 in the morning, and Dutch Calloway's bell rang 15 minutes later, that harsh sound summoning the field workers from their cabins. Patience. Drummond joined the line, heading toward the tobacco fields while her daughter watched from the manor house kitchen window, watching as Bess kneaded dough for the morning's biscuits. The temperature was already climbing toward what would become another scorching day. Ruby's duties that morning included helping Bess with breakfast service, polishing the silver in the dining room until it gleamed, beating dust from the parlor rugs until her arms ached. She performed these tasks mechanically, her mind somewhere else entirely. The night before, she'd overheard Dutch Calloway telling Samuel Rutledge that Patience had been slacking in her evening duties, leaving the barn before all her tasks were properly completed. Ruby had seen her mother's exhaustion firsthand, the way she'd been moving slower lately, holding her side as if something hurt deep inside there. The day dragged on in that oppressive heat. By afternoon, 3 more field workers had collapsed, requiring the plantation doctor to be summoned from his rounds at a neighboring property. Samuel Rutledge paced his study, calculating the cost of lost labor against the value of potentially damaged workers, reducing human beings to simple mathematics. Dutch Calloway sent word that he was extending the workday by an hour to make up for lost time. That decision rippled through the slave quarters with silent dread that hung heavy in the air. Patience returned from the fields at 7:30 that evening. Her dress was soaked completely through with sweat, red clay caked on her bare feet. Ruby saw her from the second-floor landing where she was dusting banisters, watched her mother pause at the well to drink deeply before heading toward the barn. There was something in Patience's posture, a heaviness that went beyond physical exhaustion, something that made Ruby deeply uneasy without understanding why. What happened next? We know from multiple sources that somehow survived. The confession letter itself, testimony given 3 decades later when people finally felt safe enough to speak, physical evidence documented when the barn was finally properly examined in 1847. The accounts don't always align perfectly, memories shift over time, details blur, but certain facts remain absolutely undisputed. At approximately 8:15 that evening, as dusk settled over Magnolia Ridge like a suffocating blanket, Ruby finished her duties and was sent to the servants' quarters to sleep. Instead, driven by worry she couldn't fully articulate, couldn't put into words even to herself, she circled back toward the barn. The sky had turned that particular purple-gray color of southern twilight, and cicadas were beginning their evening chorus, that endless buzzing sound. She approached quietly, the way enslaved children learned to move, making herself small and unobtrusive, practically invisible. The barn's main door stood partially open, and lamplight spilled from within, casting long shadows. She could hear voices. 2 of them. One was her mother's, pleading, desperate, and another that made her stomach clench with immediate fear. Ruby crept to the side of the barn, where gaps between the planks allowed thin slivers of vision inside. What she saw through those gaps would be described in her own handwriting 40 years later, when arthritis had twisted her fingers into gnarled knots but hadn't erased a single detail from her memory. Inside the barn, Patience stood near the horse stalls, backed against the wall with nowhere to go. Dutch Calloway faced her, his body blocking the only door. His voice was slurred, thick with alcohol. The whiskey bottle sat visible on his makeshift desk. He was speaking about disrespect, about teaching lessons, about things Ruby was too young to fully understand, but old enough to fear in her bones. Patience was trying to talk her way out, using that careful, deferential tone that survival absolutely demanded. "Mr. Calloway, sir, I done all the work you asked. The horses is fed and watered proper. The stalls is mucked clean. Everything just like you wanted it. You questioning me?" His voice rose sharply. "You saying I'm a liar?" "No, sir, I ain't saying nothing like that. I'm just trying to—" The first blow came fast, brutal, his fist connecting with Patience's jaw with a sound Ruby would hear in nightmares for the rest of her life, that wet crack of bone against bone. Her mother stumbled, tried desperately to catch herself on the stall door, and Calloway hit her again, this time driving his fist into her ribs with sickening force. Ruby's child mind screamed at her to run, to get help, to do something, anything, but she was frozen absolutely still, small fingers gripping the rough barnwood, unable to look away or move forward, trapped between terror and the desperate need to know what was happening to her mother. She watched her mother fall to the ground, watched Calloway kick her once, twice, watched Patience try to curl into herself for protection, making herself as small as possible. Then came the moment that would define absolutely everything that followed. Samuel Rutledge appeared in the barn doorway. one crystalline instant that seemed to stretch forever. Ruby thought salvation had arrived. The master would stop this violence. He would protect her mother. That's what the carefully maintained myth of paternalistic plantation management promised, wasn't it? That masters were cruel but just, harsh but ultimately protective of their property, their investments. Samuel Rutledge stood in that doorway for perhaps 5 seconds, maybe less, taking in the entire scene. His overseer, drunk and violent. His enslaved worker bleeding on the barn floor. His niece's words from dinner echoed in that space like a ghost. "You're too soft with them, Uncle." Father always said discipline maintains proper order. What Ruby saw in his face wasn't anger at Calloway. It wasn't shock or horror at the violence. It was calculation, cold and clear. "She attacked you," Samuel Rutledge said. It wasn't a question. It was an instruction, a script being handed to the overseer. Dutch Calloway, breathing hard, seemed to understand immediately, instinctively. "Yes, sir," came at me with a pitchfork. Had to defend myself against assault. Patience tried to speak, blood bubbling from her lips, her voice weak and desperate. "No, Master Samuel, please. I never touched." But Samuel Rutledge had already turned away, his decision made in those 5 seconds. His boots crunched on the gravel path as he spoke over his shoulder. "Do what's necessary to restore order, Mr. Calloway. I'll inform the house staff there was an incident. An unfortunate but necessary incident." He walked out of the barn, heading back toward the manor house, leaving Patience Drummond to her fate. Dutch Calloway looked down at Patience, and something shifted fundamentally in his expression. With the master's implicit permission, his explicit instruction, he no longer needed to restrain himself at all. Ruby watched her mother die. The details are too brutal to recount in their entirety. And the confession letter's second writer, that 8-year-old child Ruby, struggled desperately to find words for what she witnessed through those gaps in the barn wall. She wrote of sounds, the wet crack of something breaking inside her mother's body. Her mother's beautiful singing voice reduced to gasping whimpers that grew quieter and quieter. The barn cats fleeing from the overwhelming smell of blood. She wrote of standing paralyzed by absolute horror and the knowledge that screaming would mean her own death, that calling out would accomplish nothing except adding another body to the floor. When it was finally over, when Patience Drummond's body lay completely still in the blood-soaked straw, Dutch Calloway stood over her, breathing hard from his exertions. He took a long drink from his whiskey bottle, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Then he looked directly at the gap in the barn wall where Ruby's eye had been pressed. Seeing her there in the darkness, "I see you, girl," he said quietly. Ruby ran. She ran through the darkening plantation grounds, past the slave quarters where people had learned not to hear screaming, learned to be deaf when survival demanded it, past the well where her mother had taken her last drink of cool water, toward the only refuge an 8-year-old enslaved child could imagine, the big house where Master Thomas slept, where Aunt Margaret maintained order, where surely someone would help, someone would care. She stumbled through the kitchen door where Bess was banking the fires for the night. The old woman's face went pale as Ruby burst in, covered in barn dust and pure terror, her eyes wild. "Child, what on earth? Master killed my mama in the barn." The words tumbled out, truth unfiltered by strategy or survival instinct, unguarded by the careful lies enslaved people learned to tell. Master Samuel was right there, and he told Mr. Calloway to do it, and my mama's dead, and he saw me watching, and... Bess's hand clamped over Ruby's mouth, cutting off that flood of desperate words. For a long moment, the two of them stood frozen in the kitchen's residual heat, the old woman's eyes full of a fear that mirrored Ruby's own, understanding immediately what the child had just done. "You listen to me," Bess whispered, her voice shaking with terror. "You don't say them words again, you hear me? Not ever. Not if you want to live to see morning light." But it was too late. Far too late. Samuel Rutledge stood in the kitchen doorway, Margaret beside him, both having heard every single word. Thomas in his nightshirt peered around his aunt's skirts, curious about the commotion, wondering what had brought him from his bed. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream could ever be. Samuel Rutledge's face was unreadable, the same expression he wore when reviewing accounts or calculating crop yields. He was solving a problem, Ruby realized, with the clarity of absolute terror. She was a problem that needed solving, a loose end that needed tying up. "The child is hysterical," he said finally, addressing Margaret as if Ruby wasn't even there. She's had a shock. Her mother suffered an accident in the barn, resisted necessary discipline, and met with tragedy. The overseer was defending himself against violent assault. Tragic, certainly, but necessary under the circumstances. He looked at Ruby then with eyes that held no warmth, no mercy whatsoever. Only cold assessment, the way you'd look at a broken tool. The girl, however, he continued slowly, is making extremely dangerous accusations. Margaret Rutledge's hand tightened protectively on her nephew Thomas's shoulder. What are you suggesting, Samuel? She saw nothing meaningful. She understands nothing about what actually happened. She'll be locked in the cellar tonight while we determine what's to be done with her. He turned to Bess, who was still holding Ruby's arm. Take her down now. Don't let her speak to anyone else. As Bess's trembling hands pulled Ruby toward the cellar stairs, the child finally began to scream. The sound that had been trapped in her throat since watching her mother's murder finally erupted from her chest. She screamed her mother's name, screamed the truth at the top of her lungs, screamed accusations that would have gotten any adult enslaved person killed immediately and without question. Thomas Rutledge, 8 years old and carefully sheltered from the plantation's brutal realities, asked the question that would haunt him for decades to come. Aunt Margaret, why is Ruby crying like that? Where's her mama gone? Margaret's response was cut off as Bess dragged Ruby down into the darkness of the cellar, a stone-walled space that smelled of damp earth and stored potatoes, where the child's screams would be muffled by thick walls and the willful deafness of everyone who heard them. Above, in the barn, Dutch Calloway was methodically cleaning up the evidence of what he would forever claim was self-defense against a violent enslaved woman. The pitchfork he carefully placed near Patience's body had never once been touched by her hands. The marks on his own face, which he deliberately inflicted on himself using his fingernails, would corroborate his story perfectly, and in his study, Samuel Rutledge dipped his pen in ink and began writing the official account in his plantation ledger. August 14, 1834. Enslaved woman Patience Drummond, age 26, killed while attacking overseer Dutch Calloway with farming implement. Necessary force employed to subdue aggressor. Daughter Ruby, aged 8, witnessed aftermath and became hysterical with grief. Matter resolved according to law. Total property loss, one field hand valued at $600. The numbers didn't lie, Samuel Rutledge believed. Numbers were clean, orderly, free from the messy complications of truth and conscience. In the cellar, Ruby Drummond huddled in the darkness and understood with the terrible wisdom that traumatized children acquire. Understood exactly what her life was worth. Morning light filtered weakly through the cellar's single high window when Bess returned, carrying a tin cup of water and a piece of cornbread. Ruby hadn't slept, couldn't possibly sleep, kept seeing her mother's face in the darkness every time she closed her eyes. The old woman's hands shook violently as she set down that meager breakfast. Child, you listen carefully now, Bess whispered, glancing nervously toward the cellar stairs. Master Samuels called for the magistrate. Says there needs to be an official inquiry into what happened. Dutch Calloway done told his version already. Says your mama tried to kill him and he defended himself. Says you ain't seen nothing but the aftermath, that you're making up stories because you're grieving and don't understand. But I saw it, Ruby insisted. Don't matter what you saw, Bess's voice cracked with emotion. You're 8 years old and enslaved. The judge ain't going to believe nothing you say against a white overseer. And if you keep telling your story, if you keep saying Master Samuel was there... She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. The implication hung in the air like smoke. The magistrate, Judge Edmund Pritchard, arrived at 10 o'clock that morning, riding up the Oak Line Drive in his carriage. He was 56 years old, had presided over Charleston County for 18 years, and owned a small plantation of his own 20 miles south. He and Samuel Rutledge belonged to the same gentlemen's club in Charleston, attended the same church every Sunday, moved in identical social circles. They were friends. The inquiry, such as it was, took place in Samuel Rutledge's study, behind closed doors. Dutch Calloway presented his account first, standing respectfully with his hat in his hands, his face showing those scratches he'd inflicted on himself the night before. He spoke of Patience's insolent behavior, her refusal to complete assigned tasks properly, and finally her violent assault with a pitchfork when he confronted her about her defiance. I feared for my life, Your Honor, Calloway said, his voice steady and practiced. She came at me like a wild animal, completely unprovoked. I had no choice whatsoever but to defend myself. It's a tragedy, truly it is, but a man has a right to protect himself from assault. Judge Pritchard made careful notes in a leather-bound book. Were there any witnesses to this attack? The girl Ruby came to the barn after it was all over. Found her mama dead and, well, she's just a child. Can't rightly understand what happened. She's been telling all sorts of wild stories, saying things that simply ain't true. Grief talking, I reckon. Just a child's confused grief. Samuel Rutledge corroborated the overseer's timeline perfectly, carefully omitting his own presence in the barn during those crucial moments. I heard a commotion from my study, investigated afterward, found Calloway shaken but unharmed and the woman deceased. The girl was hysterical, as Mr. Calloway said, making accusations that are simply impossible, completely unfounded. And what are these accusations? Judge Pritchard asked, his pen poised. Samuel hesitated, choosing his words with extreme care. She claims I was present during the incident and somehow complicit in what occurred. The ravings of a traumatized child, nothing more. I was in my study reviewing accounts at the time in question. My sister can verify this absolutely. Margaret Rutledge called to provide testimony, confirmed her brother's alibi without once meeting Judge Pritchard's eyes. Samuel was indeed in his study working. I brought him tea at 8 o'clock and saw him there at his desk. I heard nothing unusual whatsoever until the girl came running into the house screaming about her mother. The judge closed his notebook with finality. I see no reason to pursue this matter any further. A tragic incident of entirely justified force against violent resistance. Mr. Calloway acted well within his rights as overseer. The enslaved woman's death, while regrettable, appears completely lawful under South Carolina law. He looked directly at Samuel. The girl will need to be managed very carefully. Such accusations, even from a child, can be problematic for community harmony. She'll be dealt with most appropriately, Samuel assured him. Ruby, still locked in the cellar, was never called to give testimony. In the legal framework of 1834 South Carolina, her words had no weight whatsoever, no validity, no power to contradict the narrative that had been so carefully, so deliberately constructed. But someone else had heard her screams the night before. Thomas Rutledge, that 8-year-old heir to Magnolia Ridge, couldn't forget Ruby's voice crying out those accusations. The boy had been raised to accept the social order of plantation life as natural and divinely ordained, taught that this was simply how the world worked. But something about Ruby's terror had disturbed him profoundly, shaken something fundamental in his understanding. She was close to his own age, someone he'd seen nearly every single day of his life, and now she was locked in the cellar like a dangerous criminal. That afternoon, while his father met with Judge Pritchard and his aunt supervised the preparation of Patience's body for burial in the slave cemetery, Thomas slipped down to the cellar when no one was watching. Ruby sat in the corner, hugging her knees tight to her chest. Tear tracks dried on her dusty face. She looked up as lamplight preceded the boy down the stairs, and for a long moment they simply stared at each other. Two children divided by absolutely everything their society considered immutable and sacred. "Did you really see what happened?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruby's first instinct was to deny everything, to recant immediately, to say whatever would keep her alive. But looking at Thomas's face, so similar to her own in its youth and confusion and uncertainty, something broke inside her chest. She told him the truth. Every single detail. Her mother's desperate pleas, Dutch Calloway's violence, and most damning of all, Samuel Rutledge's moment of choice in that barn doorway, his decision to turn away. Thomas listened in growing horror, his face getting paler and paler. But Father wouldn't. He's always saying we have responsibilities to our people, that we treat them fairly. Your father watched my mama die, Ruby said, her voice completely hollow, drained of all emotion. And then he just walked away like it was nothing. The boy's face went deathly pale. He opened his mouth to protest, to defend his father, to say this couldn't possibly be true. But the words wouldn't come because some part of him, the part that hadn't yet been fully molded by the system he'd inherit, recognized truth when he heard it spoken. "I have to go," he said finally, backing toward the stairs in confusion. "Master Thomas," Ruby called after him, using the title that reinforced the unbridgeable gulf between them, even as she sought his help. "Please, they're going to sell me or worse." "Don't let them, please." Thomas fled up the stairs without answering. But Ruby's plea haunted him completely. That night, He did something that would eventually lead to the confession letter's discovery 113 years later. He began keeping a secret journal, recording everything he'd heard and witnessed in his careful child's handwriting, documenting truths that the official records would systematically erase. Patience. Drummond was buried the next day in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery, a plot of land beyond the tobacco fields where the plantation's enslaved workers rested without headstones or ceremony or acknowledgement. The burial was quick and perfunctory, over in minutes. Samuel Rutledge did not attend, but he did carefully note the expense of lost work time in his ledger, calculating the cost of allowing workers to bury their dead. Ruby remained in the cellar for 3 more days while her fate was decided behind closed doors. Samuel Rutledge consulted with other planters about how to properly handle an enslaved child who had witnessed something she shouldn't have and, worse, had actually spoken about it. The consensus was deeply troubling. Such a witness was genuinely dangerous. Her very existence posed a threat to the carefully maintained order that kept everything functioning smoothly. Several options were discussed at length. Selling her would simply move the problem elsewhere, and her story might spread like disease through other plantations. Harsh punishment might silence her, but could also make her a martyr among the other enslaved workers, someone whose suffering would be remembered and whispered about. What was needed, the planters agreed, was a solution that would be both effective and maintain that crucial facade of benevolent paternalism. Margaret Rutledge provided the answer. On the 4th day of Ruby's imprisonment, Margaret descended the cellar stairs carrying a clean dress and a wash basin. She set them down and regarded the child with an expression that was neither cruel nor kind. Simply pragmatic, businesslike. "You'll be staying in the house permanently from now on," Margaret announced without preamble. "You'll have a small room off the kitchen, better accommodations than the quarters. Your duties will increase significantly, but so will your privileges. Better food, warmer shelter in winter. But there are very specific conditions that you must understand completely." Ruby said nothing, understanding instinctively that no response was expected or desired. "You will never speak of what you think you saw in that barn. Not to the other servants, not to visiting guests, not to anyone ever again, not even to yourself. If you do, you'll be sold immediately to a plantation in Georgia where they work rice fields in snake-infested swamps, and you'll be dead within a year. Do you understand me perfectly?" "Yes, ma'am," Ruby whispered. "More than that," Margaret continued, her voice dropping even lower. "You will actively support the official version of events. If anyone asks, you arrived at the barn after the incident was over. You saw your mother's body and assumed wrongly in your grief that something improper had occurred. Your grief made you temporarily irrational. You understand now that Mr. Calloway acted in legitimate self-defense. Can you say that for me?" Ruby's mouth went completely dry. To survive, she would have to become complicit in her own mother's murder. Would have to speak words that betrayed Patience's memory, that made her suffering meaningless. But what choice did an 8-year-old enslaved child have in this world? "I can say that," she whispered, feeling something die inside her chest. "Good," Margaret said with satisfaction. "Then we understand each other perfectly." She turned to leave, but paused at the stairs, looking back. "Your mother's death was deeply unfortunate, but order must be maintained above all else. You're intelligent enough to understand that reality. I think intelligence can be either a curse or a gift. Ruby, the choice of which it becomes is entirely yours to make." The room off the kitchen where Ruby was installed measured perhaps 8 feet by 6, barely large enough for a narrow bed and a small trunk for her meager belongings. But it had a door that actually closed, a window that opened to let in air, and most importantly, it was in the main house under Margaret Rutledge's direct and constant supervision. Ruby would be watched continuously, her every word monitored carefully, her every action scrutinized for signs of rebellion. Life at Magnolia Ridge returned to its established routines. The tobacco was harvested on schedule. Dutch Calloway continued as overseer, his authority completely unchallenged. Judge Pritchard's official report declared the matter permanently closed. And Ruby Drummond, 8 years old and orphaned, learned to perform her new role flawlessly. The grateful enslaved child who had been shown extraordinary mercy after making false accusations born of grief and confusion. But late at night, in that small room off the kitchen, Ruby would press her ear to the wall and listen to the house settling around her, to Margaret's footsteps above, to Samuel Rutledge's voice discussing business matters with visitors. She listened, and she remembered, storing every single detail in a memory that would prove far more permanent than any official record could ever be. And in his room on the second floor, Thomas Rutledge continued his secret journal, writing in a child's uncertain hand about the night Ruby came screaming into the house, about the story she'd told him in the cellar, about the doubt that had taken root in his heart regarding his father's character, growing like poison. The two children, separated by the vast, impossible gulf of their circumstances, were unknowingly documenting the truth that adults had worked so desperately hard to bury. Years would pass before their written words would finally converge in that confession letter hidden in the walls. Decades would elapse before anyone would read what they'd so carefully recorded. But the truth, once witnessed by innocent eyes, is never truly destroyed. It simply waits in the darkness, patient as death itself, for its moment to emerge into the light. The silence that settled over Magnolia Ridge in the months following Patience's death was not peaceful. It was the silence of secrets carefully guarded, of questions deliberately unasked, of an entire community that had collectively agreed to look away from uncomfortable truths that threatened their way of life. Dutch Calloway grew bolder in his authority with each passing day. With Samuel Rutledge's implicit endorsement of his actions, the overseer no longer felt any need for restraint whatsoever. His drinking increased steadily, and so did his violence toward the enslaved workers under his control. By December of 1834, 3 more people had died under circumstances officially attributed to accidents or natural causes, but which the slave quarters understood very differently, the truth passing in whispers. Clara, one of the elderly house servants, found herself increasingly unable to keep quiet about what she sensed in her bones. Though she hadn't witnessed Patience's death directly, she'd known the woman for years, had helped raise Ruby from infancy, and understood that the official story simply didn't align with the Patience she'd known intimately. One afternoon, while preparing dinner with only Bess and Ruby present in the kitchen, Clara spoke carefully, testing the waters. "That pitchfork they said your mama grabbed," she said to Ruby, not looking up from the potatoes she was peeling. Patience was left-handed. Everybody who knew her knew that plain as day. But the pitchfork was found on the right side of her body. Funny thing that Ruby, now 9 years old and hardened by months of enforced silence, said absolutely nothing in response. But she filed away the detail carefully, adding it to the growing catalog of discrepancies she was mentally compiling, storing away for some future she couldn't yet imagine. Bess shot Clara a warning look, sharp as a knife. "Ain't our place to question what happened. The judge said it was lawful. That's all we need to know." "Judge said a lot of things that don't add up if you think about it," Clara muttered rebelliously. But she dropped the subject immediately when Margaret Rutledge's footsteps sounded in the hallway, her presence ending all dangerous conversation. That winter was particularly harsh and cruel. Snow fell in Charleston, a genuine rarity that locals took as an ill omen, a sign of God's displeasure. The tobacco crop had been poor, and Samuel Rutledge's financial situation grew increasingly precarious. He spent growing amounts of time in Charleston meeting with creditors and potential investors, leaving the plantation's daily operations to his sister and Dutch Calloway, a combination that boded ill. During one of these absences in February 1835, something happened that would later prove significant in unraveling the full scope of what had occurred. A traveler appeared at Magnolia Ridge, a man named Jacob Winters, who identified himself as a journalist from Boston, writing about agricultural practices throughout the South. Margaret Rutledge, adhering strictly to Southern hospitality traditions, invited him to stay for dinner and spend the night in their guest room. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly suspect, was that Winters was actually connected to the nascent abolitionist movement, traveling under completely false pretenses to document conditions on Southern plantations with his own eyes. Thomas Rutledge, now 9 years old, was allowed to dine with the adults that evening. Ruby served at table, her presence invisible in the way enslaved servants were trained to be, practically transparent. But she was listening, always listening, and what she heard that night gave her something she'd lost completely since her mother's death. Hope, fragile as spun glass. Winters spoke eloquently about moral philosophy, about pressing questions of justice and human dignity. He was extremely careful not to directly criticize slavery, knowing such commentary would get him immediately ejected from the house and possibly worse. But his implications were crystal clear to anyone paying real attention. "I've heard disturbing accounts recently," Winters said casually, accepting a second helping of sweet potatoes from Ruby's serving dish, "of incidents on plantations being systematically covered up by local authorities. Deaths ruled as accidents when all the evidence suggests otherwise. It seems the system rather protects itself, doesn't it?" Margaret's smile was absolutely glacial. "I'm quite certain such things occur on poorly managed properties. Here at Magnolia Ridge, we maintain proper order and treat our people exceedingly well. Discipline when absolutely necessary, certainly, but never cruelty." "I'm genuinely relieved to hear it," Winters said smoothly. "Although I understand there was a tragic incident here relatively recently. An enslaved woman killed by your overseer. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees instantly." Margaret set down her fork with deliberate, careful precision. "A clear matter of self-defense, fully investigated and resolved by the magistrate. The woman assaulted Mr. Calloway with a farming implement. He had no choice." "How absolutely terrible for all involved," Winters said. But his eyes had shifted subtly to Ruby, standing motionless by the sideboard. "Was the woman's family compensated in any way for their loss?" "Compensated?" Margaret's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. "Mr. Winters, I think you may have spent far too much time in Boston. The woman was property. One compensates an owner for property loss, not family members who are themselves property. That's simply how the system functions. Of course, I forget sometimes the legal distinctions that apply here." He turned his attention directly to Thomas, making the boy uncomfortable. "And you, young man, do you enjoy life on the plantation?" Thomas, who had been silent throughout the entire meal, struggled visibly with his answer. In the months since Ruby's cellar confession, he'd become increasingly troubled by the contradictions between what he was taught about honorable Southern values and what he'd witnessed with his own eyes. His secret journal had grown to 50 pages, filled with observations that would horrify his father completely. "It's all I've known, sir," Thomas finally answered carefully. The cautious reply of a child who'd learned that honesty could be genuinely dangerous. After dinner, as Ruby cleared the dishes with practiced efficiency, Winters found a brief moment to speak to her alone in the hallway. His words came quick, barely above a whisper. "The woman who died, she was your mother, wasn't she?" Ruby's hands tightened reflexively on the serving platter. She glanced around nervously, acutely aware that being caught in conversation with a guest could bring severe punishment. "Yes, sir," she whispered. "Did it happen the way they claim?" She looked into his eyes and saw something there she hadn't seen in months. Genuine concern, a willingness to actually hear truth. For a moment she was desperately tempted to tell him everything, to unburden herself to someone who might actually care about what she'd witnessed. But survival instincts honed over 6 brutal months of enforced silence prevailed. "It happened like they said, sir. My mama, she wasn't herself that day. The heat, maybe. She did something foolish and Mr. Calloway had to defend himself. I miss her something terrible, but I understand now it wasn't nobody's fault but hers." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, bitter and choking, but they were the words that kept her alive. Winters studied her face closely, clearly recognizing the carefully rehearsed quality of her response, the way the words sounded memorized. "I see. Well, if you ever need to tell a different story, a true story, there are people in Charleston who would listen carefully. The Society of Friends, they're called Quakers. They have a meeting house on King Street. They help people sometimes when the law won't." Before Ruby could respond, before she could even process what he was offering, Margaret Rutledge appeared in the hallway like a ghost. "Ruby, take those dishes to the kitchen immediately. Mr. Winters, perhaps you'd enjoy a brandy in the parlor." The moment passed, fragile and brief, but the seed had been planted deep. There were people who might actually help, who might believe her story. The knowledge was dangerous, potentially fatal, but also sustaining, a tiny flame of hope in overwhelming darkness. Winters left the next morning, but not before slipping a small card into Thomas's hand during breakfast when no one was looking. On it was written an address in Charleston and a single sentence: "Truth matters, even when it's dangerous to tell." Thomas hid the card carefully in his journal, another secret added to the growing collection. Spring arrived with its usual beauty, and with it came changes to Magnolia Ridge, that would set in motion the events leading inexorably to the confession letter's eventual creation. Samuel Rutledge's financial troubles deepened dramatically. The previous year's poor tobacco harvest, combined with falling prices and steadily mounting debts, forced him to seriously consider selling portions of his enslaved workforce. The prospect terrified everyone in the slave quarters as families faced potential separation, the nightmare that haunted every enslaved person's sleep. In April 1835, a cotton broker from Georgia named Vernon Tisdale visited the plantation to assess which workers might be sold profitably. He was a hard man with calculating eyes, known throughout the region for purchasing enslaved people in bulk and transporting them to the expanding cotton plantations in the Deep South, where mortality rates were significantly higher than in the Upper South, where death came faster. Dutch Calloway escorted Tisdale through the quarters with obvious relish, presenting workers like livestock at auction. Ruby watched from the kitchen window as men and women were examined clinically, their teeth checked for signs of decay, their muscles assessed for strength, their value calculated down to the dollar. When they approached the house, Margaret called Ruby into the parlor where Tisdale was reviewing paperwork with Samuel Rutledge. "This is Ruby," Samuel said matter-of-factly. House servant, trained since early childhood, literate enough to read basic instructions, obedient and exceptionally quiet. Tisdale walked slowly around Ruby in a deliberate circle, his assessment clinical and dehumanizing, examining property. "How old exactly? 9 years? Prime age for training in more complex household duties. Any health issues?" Tisdale asked. "Behavioral problems of any kind." Samuel hesitated, and in that tiny pause, Ruby understood her fate was being decided right there in that moment. There was an incident last year. Her mother died and the girl made some inappropriate accusations in her grief. But she's since been thoroughly corrected and has given absolutely no trouble since. Tisdale's interest sharpened immediately like a predator sensing weakness. "What kind of accusations specifically?" "Nothing of real consequence. A child's complete misunderstanding of events. She's learned better now, learned her proper place. Children who make accusations can be problematic when they grow older." Tisdale mused thoughtfully. "Memories can be dangerous things, especially in adolescence. On the other hand, a well-trained house servant is genuinely valuable. Difficult to find." He named a price that made Samuel's expression brighten noticeably with relief. Ruby felt the floor tilt sickeningly beneath her feet. She was being sold, after months of forced complicity, of speaking lies to preserve her life, of betraying her mother's memory daily. She was being sent away anyway, shipped to Georgia, where she'd likely die in cotton fields before reaching adulthood, where her story would die with her. That night, Ruby made a decision that would alter the course of several lives forever. She would run. She would escape or die trying. Escape attempts from South Carolina plantations were common enough, though success rates were dismally low. The geography worked against runaways viciously, with swamps and rivers and hundreds of miles separating the enslaved from free states. But Ruby was 9 years old, desperate beyond measure, and had absolutely nothing left to lose. She confided her plan to only one person, Thomas Rutledge. It was a calculated risk, potentially suicidal. Thomas could easily betray her, could run immediately to his father. But over the past months, she'd observed his growing discomfort with his father's actions, observed him struggling with doubts, writing constantly in that journal, asking questions that made adults visibly uncomfortable. He was, Ruby sensed with desperate hope, someone who might still be capable of choosing conscience over convenience. She found him in the library one afternoon, supposedly studying Latin, but actually writing furiously in his journal as always. "Master Thomas, I need to tell you something important," she said quietly. He looked up, startled by her presence. They rarely spoke directly anymore, the distance between their worlds having been deliberately reinforced by the previous year's events. "What is it?" he asked cautiously. "They're selling me to that Georgia man. I'm going to run tonight." "I'm going to try." Thomas's face went deathly pale. "Ruby, you can't. They'll catch you within days. They always catch runaways. The dogs, the patrols, the rewards. I'd rather die trying to be free than die slowly picking cotton in Georgia," Ruby said with absolute finality. "But I'm telling you because," she took a deep breath, gathering courage, "because you've been writing about what happened to my mama. I've seen you. And I think you believe me about what really happened. even if you can't say so out loud. Thomas closed his journal protectively, defensive. How did you know about my journal? I pay attention. I see things people think I don't see. And I know you're a good person, Master Thomas, even if your daddy ain't. So I'm asking you to wait 3 days before you tell anyone I'm gone. Just 3 days. Give me a chance to reach Charleston. If they find out I knew and didn't tell immediately, then say I lied to you. Say I told you I was just going to visit someone in the quarters. Say I tricked you. They'll believe that over believing you helped me. They'll always believe the worst of me. Thomas stared at his journal, at those pages filled with his private rebellion against the system he was supposed to embrace and inherit. Ruby was asking him to transform those written doubts into concrete action, to risk his own comfort and safety for her slim chance at survival. 3 days, he finally whispered. But Ruby, even if you somehow reach Charleston, where will you go? The city has slave catchers everywhere, and you're so young. The Quakers might help. That Mr. Winters said they would. I'll figure something out. I have to try. That night, Ruby wrapped her few possessions in a cloth bundle. A spare dress, a piece of cornbread saved from dinner, and something she'd kept hidden since her mother's death. A small wooden bird Patience had carved for her years ago, back when life still held moments of beauty. It was all she had left of the woman whose murder she'd witnessed. The house settled into sleep around midnight. Ruby slipped from her small room, moved silently through the darkened kitchen, avoiding the boards that creaked, and eased open the back door. The spring air was warm and humid, filled with the endless chorus of frogs from the nearby creek. She'd studied the route during her months of kitchen duties, knew which paths the patrols favored, which roads led toward Charleston. She'd made it perhaps 200 yards from the house when a voice stopped her cold, freezing her in place. Going somewhere, girl. Dutch Calloway stepped from behind an outbuilding, and Ruby's heart plummeted straight into her stomach. He'd been drinking heavily. She could smell the whiskey even from 10 feet away, and his expression held a malice that made her stomach clench with pure terror. Thought you might try something like this, he said, moving closer with predatory intent. Been watching you carefully, seeing that rebellious look in your eye, just like your mama had right before she died. Ruby backed away slowly, her mind racing desperately through impossible options. Run and he'd catch her easily. Scream and she'd wake the house, ensuring her sale or immediate worse. Fight and she was 9 years old facing a grown man. You know what happened to your mama, Calloway continued, his voice taking on a taunting quality fueled by alcohol. You know, because you saw everything. Samuel thinks you forgot, thinks you learned to keep quiet like a good girl. But I've seen the way you look at me. You remember every single thing. I don't know what you're talking about, Ruby said automatically, the rehearsed lie coming by instinct. Don't play stupid with me. You were there, watching through them barn boards. I saw your eye, saw you standing there while He stopped abruptly, seeming to realize he was confessing to murder. While I defended myself against your mama's attack, please, Mr. Calloway, I was just going to the quarters to... Shut your mouth. His hand shot out and grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, crushing. You think I'm going to let you run off to Charleston and tell your stories to those abolitionists? You think I'm that stupid? From the darkness, another voice spoke clearly. Let her go immediately. Thomas Rutledge stepped into the moonlight, his father's hunting rifle held in his small hands. The boy was trembling violently, the weapon clearly too heavy for him, but he held it pointed in Calloway's general direction with desperate determination. Master Thomas? Calloway said, his tone shifting instantly to forced respect. The girl was running away. I caught her, just doing my job properly. I said let her go, Thomas repeated, his voice shaking but steady. You don't understand what you're doing, boy. Your father? My father watched Ruby's mother die and did absolutely nothing to stop it, Thomas said. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them inside for months, years. Ruby told me the truth, and I believe her completely. I've been watching you, Mr. Calloway. I've seen how the workers fear you. I've seen the cruelty. I've written it all down. Everything I've seen and heard. Calloway's face darkened with pure rage. You have no idea what you're talking about, you privileged little boy. What I've done with your father's explicit blessing. He needed order maintained properly, and I maintained it exactly as he wanted. He needed you to murder someone innocent, Thomas shot back. She attacked me with a weapon. Ruby was right there. She saw the whole thing. My father was there too, wasn't he? That's what Ruby told me in the cellar that night. And that's exactly what you're afraid people will find out. The standoff held for a long, impossibly tense moment. 3 people frozen in the Carolina moonlight, each acutely aware that what happened next would reshape all their futures irrevocably. Finally, Calloway released Ruby's arm with a violent shove that sent her stumbling backward. You're making a terrible mistake, boy. A mistake that's going to cost you and your father absolutely everything you have. Maybe so, Thomas said, his voice steadier now, stronger. But at least I'll be able to look at myself in a mirror. At least I'll be able to live with myself. Calloway stalked back toward his quarters, and Ruby knew with absolute certainty they'd made an enemy who would never forget this moment, who would seek revenge. Thomas lowered the rifle carefully, which Ruby suddenly realized hadn't even been loaded, completely empty. You need to go right now, he said urgently. Before he wakes my father, head for Charleston as fast as you can. Find those Quakers like Mr. Winters said. I'll tell them you snuck away while I was sleeping. They'll come looking for you, but you'll have a head start. Why are you helping me like this? Ruby asked, stunned. Thomas was quiet for a moment, struggling to articulate something beyond his years. Because what happened to your mother was fundamentally wrong. Because my father taught me that honorable men stand up for what's right. And then he showed me through his actions that he doesn't believe his own words. Because he struggled to find the right words. Because if I don't help you, then I'm just as guilty as he is. Ruby wanted desperately to thank him, to express gratitude for a kindness she'd never expected from the master's son, from someone who by all rights should have been her enemy. But there was no time. She ran into the darkness, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known, carrying nothing but a wooden bird and the memory of her mother's murder burning in her heart. Behind her, Thomas Rutledge returned to his room and wrote furiously in his journal, documenting everything that had just transpired, creating a record that would one day help expose the truth to the world. And in his quarters, Dutch Calloway drank heavily and plotted detailed revenge against a 9-year-old child who'd seen too much and a boy who'd chosen the wrong side of history. The events of that night would set in motion a chain reaction that would ultimately lead to the confession letter found, hidden in those walls in 1847. But Ruby's story was far from over, and the darkest revelations about what had really happened in that barn on August 14th, 1834 were still to come. Ruby reached Charleston 3 days later, half-starved and utterly exhausted, her feet bleeding from walking rutted roads and cutting through swamps. The city overwhelmed her senses completely. The harbor smells of salt and fish and decay, the cacophony of merchants hawking goods in languages she didn't understand, the press of humanity in numbers she'd never imagined existed. She was a 9-year-old fugitive in a city absolutely full of slave catchers and professional patrollers, and she had no clear idea how to find the Quaker meeting house on King Street. For 2 days, she hid in the alleys near the docks, stealing scraps of food when she could and sleeping in the shadows of warehouses. She saw other enslaved people on errands for their masters, but she didn't dare approach them. Trust was a luxury she absolutely couldn't afford. On the 3rd day, sick with hunger and desperation, she made a terrible mistake. She tried to steal bread from a market stall, and the merchant grabbed her arm before she could run. "Got us a little thief here," he called out, and a crowd began to gather around them. "Who's your master, girl? Where you supposed to be?" Ruby's mind went completely blank with terror. In moments, someone would identify her as a runaway, and she'd be returned to Magnolia Ridge, where punishments for attempted escape were brutal and public, designed specifically to discourage others from trying. Then a woman's voice cut through the crowd with absolute authority. "She belongs to my household. I've been looking everywhere for her. Thank you for catching her." The woman who stepped forward was perhaps 40 years old, plainly dressed in gray with steel-colored hair pulled back severely. Her face was unremarkable,